For Creamer Media's Policy, I'm Sashni Madli. Joining me today is author Hayden Eastwood, here to discuss his book, Like Sodium in Water. Welcome, Hayden.
Hello.
Now, yours is a heartbreaking memoir of growing up in Zimbabwe and you detailing your family life. But you are reluctant to call this book a memoir. Why is that?
I'm reluctant to call it a memoir because, in my eyes, a memoir implies knowledge of what happened in a kind of certain way and in a truthful way. And I think what I'm describing is so subjective and so of my own personal world that I find it difficult to say that it's a representation of the country or the time in any way more than my personal sphere.
Now, you also detail growing up in Zim post-independence. Tell us about that and tell us a bit about your family life at that time.
Well, for me personally, growing up in the 80s as I did, having a childhood in the 80s was fabulous. I mean, the war had finished, we were starting businesses, it was very safe. We didn't even used to close our gate at night. I just remember it being kind of wonderfully wild and free. You just get on your bicycle and ride wherever you wanted. School was always a little bit difficult for us. I think just because we were a little bit of a chaotic family and there was just no real rules or bedtime set, so you were kind of always on the wrong end of the stick, quite literally, at school, which I think was, I suppose the one thing that stood out as sort of not being completely idyllic all the time.
Did that mold your character in any way?
School, very much. It got me answering or asking questions, should I say, about the nature of good and evil and how human beings respond to power, all sorts of things like that.
Can you break down the title of your book for us, Like Sodium in Water?
Yeah, it just sprung into my mind when I recalled a time when I was at senior school, and I felt, adolescence was perhaps a bit like the reaction of sodium in water, which is, to say, explosive. You throw the sodium in, it kind of fizzes and froths, hydrogen gets liberated, and quite often that combusts, it just explodes, and then after it's reacted, you just get this calm. And I felt that period of my life was like that, and in many ways some of my relationships were like that.
Now, talk to us about your relationship with your brother Dan, from growing up to when you were teenagers. How did your relationship change?
So I would say, we were the best of friends and worst of enemies growing up. We played together all the time, we fought, and we were, I would say, confidence in one another, and that all just changed when we were teenagers. Not deliberately. I think as a teenage relationship it had to go through a period of reinvention as we both became men, but I suppose the closeness started to fall away, and of course when we meet the girl, all hell breaks loose.
Can you talk to us about your father's left-wing, right-wing attitude? And you also said in the book that sometimes his view of the world seemed empty. Tell us about that.
So we were brought up to believe that we were the good guys, that we were on the right side of history, and there were a lot of tales that my dad had about his time growing up in South Africa and the things that he saw, and particularly how it changed him into, or radicalized him even, into becoming a Marxist-Leninist. And in Zim, as a kid, I had all of these stories. And he used to be Mugabe's lawyer in the 70s. At one stage, he used to go and visit him in prison, and he would tell us about those times. And I was fascinated by it. And I did, for a long time, believe that we were the good guys, that we had been on the right side of history. And it was only until events in the family changed that view much later.
Now, your father was also part of the SACP. What do you know of his time during the apartheid struggle, and why did he return to Zim?
I don't know as much as I would have liked. I pieced together things from the bits that he mentioned. He often talked about being in the SACP underground. He mentioned once trying to blow up a power station with some other SACP guys. He spoke of friends of his being arrested by the apartheid police and tortured. Eventually, he was given a tip-off from somebody and told him to get out the country because his life and or his safety was in danger. And so he went back to Rhodesia at that time. And actually then the Rhodesians also kicked him out. So that's actually why I was born outside of Zim. My parents returned in 1980.
Now, also in your book, there's a bit of a struggle for you with your family because you view them as abnormal or not normal. What was abnormal about them for you, and how do you reconcile your feelings about them today?
Well, I mean, we were abnormal in the sense we were both godless, I suppose. We weren't Christians in a place which was full of Christianity, and we were left-wing in a place which wasn't. So many of my friends' fathers had fought in the war on the side of the Rhodesians, and my father had represented Mugabe. So it made for a sort of sense of isolation, I suppose.
And how do you reconcile your feelings about your family today?
Well, I mean, I'm deeply ashamed of the role that my father played in rubber stamping the elections that happened in the 80s when there was a genocide happening in Matabele land. I think much of the idea that we had of being the good guys was built on fantasy and a kind of moral narcissism. And I think in later years I've questioned that role a lot, and obviously with the way Zim has gone and the horrors that have been meted out by the regime there, it's really made me think about what motivated people to support an alternative in that form.
Now, after your brother died, you harbored terrible anger. How did you deal with his death and with the anger that followed?
I'm not entirely sure. I would say I spent a lot of time just in my own head. I played a lot of sport. I suppose I went on a lot of philosophical journeys to try and understand both why he had done what he'd done and to understand how our family had come to be in a place which had, lived for so long on so many lies.
And how did your family life change after his death?
Well, my father kind of fell to pieces, really. He started drinking, and even his kind of worldview seemed to melt a bit. The kind of left-wing, I suppose the veneer of left-wing reality began to just sort of crumble around him and around us. And eventually what happened is he starved us out of the home and we had to move out.
Now, you and your family lived through the economic deterioration in Zimbabwe, but you still live in Zim today. Why did you choose to do that?
Well, I haven't always lived there. I left in 1998 and only returned in 2012. So, I was actually away for quite a few years, 10 years in the UK and 4 years in South Africa. My mother and my brother stayed in Zim that whole time. My sister was actually also out the country for a good 10 years.
Okay.
So I returned because I realized nowhere else on the planet felt like home except for Zimbabwe. So I decided to come back for better or worse.
Okay. And with the political change in Zimbabwe, how are you seeing the country today?
I was talking about this earlier today. It's difficult to say what's going to happen. So far, I would say it feels like more of the same. Edmund Mnangagwa made all of the right sounds when he came in. I would say he had the nation's backing to begin with, and I think he's rapidly losing the people's support at the moment, and what that will mean for how they handle the elections in the next few months. Yeah, I'm not sure how it's going to play out, but they've got, I think, the option of losing power or engaging in more violence. And I think history speaks for itself as to which option they will take.
Hayden, thank you so much for speaking with us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
That was author Hayden Eastwood speaking to Polity about his book, Light Sodium in Water.